Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And let's get into it. I think this video might be a little rambly because I may have to expound on some points, but I think this is a very important topic, and I think a dense one at that. I'm not just going to be talking about the headline that is in front of me, but I also think that this story that we're going to be reading here and kind of the context surrounding it is very much related to the Kendrick Lamar story in a way that has kind of blown up this week with the white girl saying the N-word on stage while performing with Kendrick Lamar. Now, obviously, I'm coming at these topics from the standpoint of a white-skinned individual who has never personally experienced or suffered any kind of systematic oppression. So do keep that in mind. Take the things I'm saying with a grain of salt, I guess. And I guess I don't know if I need to caveat it any further than that. So here we have jazz musician Wynton Marsalis, who has been doing his thing since the 80s. And he says, according to him, in this podcast that is linked in this Washington Post article, that hip-hop and rap are more damaging than a statue of Robert E. Lee. And his statements aren't simply as bold and as reductive as they are stated right here in the headline. He actually kind of goes on as far as his philosophy as to why, and stating that this is something he's been saying for a long time now, really since the growing popularity of hip-hop music back when he was kind of starting out in jazz. Now, he kind of gets into what he feels makes hip-hop such a lackluster and such a negative genre. Now, keep in mind, he doesn't say this accounts for all the artists in the genre, all the music in the genre. He kind of did a bit of a response over here that we will get into, where a lot of his, I guess, building on the points that he was making was merely just clarifying, oh, I didn't mean all, I wasn't trying to say all, I wasn't trying to paint the whole genre with a broad brush, and so on and so forth. I mean, we could debate that. I will sort of take him at his word that that is not what he was trying to do, that is not what he was intending to do. And reading his statements, I didn't assume that was the case necessarily. I mean, it just sort of sounded like the opinion of somebody who doesn't listen to a lot of the genre, honestly, because they just don't really care for it. And a lot of his issues with it kind of came down to what he felt were just pornographic elements in the genre, elements in the genre that degraded African-American people and were just kind of lewd and nasty, just all of the sort of violent stories that tend to pop up in a lot of hip-hop records, and sexual stories, sexual content, obviously the foul language, so on and so forth. Now, me personally loving a lot of music in the genre, as well as probably a lot of you watching, should already know, coming away from that statement, that well, that doesn't necessarily apply to all records in the genre. And not every record that contains some of that material is necessarily a negative experience or a negative portrayal. I mean, there are a lot of records that contain sexually explicit content in the hip-hop genre, or obviously tales of violence or drug dealing, or a lot of sort of negative, I guess you could say, themes, but actually try to tell a bit of a cautionary tale through that, or educate through that storytelling, or I guess kind of give a window into a particular life experience that maybe a lot of people listening wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. So obviously, not even every single album that contains some of the things that Wynton has issue with would even apply to a lot of his criticisms, but I think a lot of what he was saying just merely applied to a lot of the more mainstream and more lewd and just basically more dumbed down stuff that tends to make it up into the mainstream and tends to represent the genre as a whole. And because there are a lot of people who are completely outside of the black community and really know nothing about it, falsely tend to assume that, hey, you know, maybe this is like what the black experience is in general, or how black people think or feel in general, when that couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, there are millions upon millions upon millions of black people in the United States of America, living completely normal and average lives, and do not live the life of a rapper or a gangster, or really, in their own personal lives, don't really do anything that you would typically hear rapped about on a hip hop album. And it seemed like for Wynton, that was a pretty significant distinction or point to make, that to outsiders or to people who don't understand or to people who don't get it, this music, the messages in this music could be perceived, could be interpreted a certain kind of way, could contribute to the degradation of the Black community because it could kind of poison the well or sour how people kind of view African Americans in general. And I'm sort of struggling with this point, because is it a legitimate point? Is it an illegitimate point? I mean, there's certainly a lot of older people of Wynton's generation who would certainly feel this way, who you sort of take offense to the N-word used in any and all contexts, no matter what. For example, on my wife's side of the family, the younger folk do not use that kind of language around the older folk at all. The N-word, under no circumstance. Of course, with a lot of white people, there's a lot of assumptions that with the N-word, all of them are just kind of using it freely, just all over the place. It's just rattling off in every direction with no regard whatsoever. But no, that is not in fact the case. There are still a lot of people in the Black community, and it's their right to feel that way, who have a lot of issues with the word, don't like hearing the word used, don't use the word themselves. And don't like hearing it used, if I didn't illustrate that point already. So let's get back to the question of hip hop warping the way people outside of the Black community see the Black community. Does it happen? I think the answer is demonstrably yes, with those things being pretty much your only exposure to the Black community or the Black experience. You might have kind of a weird view of what living life as a Black person is like. And I think a prime example of that is this recent Kendrick Lamar white girl on stage saying the N-word story. Because for this girl, her primary exposure to the N-word is just through rap songs that she likes. She pretty much just thinks it's a fun word that pops up in songs that she thinks are catchy. Not only that, but the way that she reacted to Kendrick Lamar telling her that he didn't want her to say that word, she was kind of indignant and saying, "Oh, what? I'm not cool enough for you, bro. We're not cool." Because to her, the N-word is just like a word for friend, or that it's just like some pass that Black people give to white people. Like if you get along with Black people, they'll just say, "Oh yeah, you could say the N-word. It's totally cool. You could say it around me. Totally cool with it. Totally comfortable with that. Just it's awesome." Like if Black people around you are cool with you saying it, then you're in the club, you're in the cool club. So when Wynton argues, hey, maybe the Black community is being perceived a certain way as a result of this hip-hop thing, he could have a point. But then the question beyond that is, should the Black community care? Should African Americans regulate their behavior because they're afraid of how what they're doing or what they're perceived as doing will look on the rest of the group? I feel like individually to that question, you're going to have to come to your own decision. But I personally don't really think so. I think ultimately the onus lies on the individual who is making the broad assumption on an entire group of people based on the actions of one person or a few, especially if that person is a famous person, because since when have the actions of famous people resembled that of your average Joe? At the end of the day, I feel like it's the individual, whether that person is a man or woman or trans or Black or white or Latino or Asian or whatever. That person should have the ability to express their individuality, be themselves, without being beholden to whatever group or groups you might be able to categorize that person in. Unless there's a statistically proven or objectively obvious pattern of behavior being observed here and we understand the rationale and the reasoning behind that behavior, there's no reason to act to said individual in any other way than, hey, that is an individual person doing an individual thing. At the end of the day, I think it's the person buying into the stereotype who is at fault, and not the individual who is doing whatever that person is doing for whatever reason they're doing it. I mean, personally, that's the standard I try to hold myself to. If I don't know or I don't get something, or at least I'm conscious of not knowing or getting it, I don't just try to make a broad assumption about that particular thing. I try to do my best to understand it and just try to see the nuance in that particular thing. As far as Wynton's statements on the Robert E. Lee statue go, he tries to build upon those in the final moments of his large, very large Facebook post over here, in which he mostly spends his time just kind of clarifying that, you know, he wasn't saying all and he wasn't implying everybody and so on and so forth. So over here, he says the Robert E. Lee statue is a symbol of a bygone era whose ideology still resonates with a segment of the population. That ideology has been rightly decried by many, me chief amongst them, as a hurtful reminder of the past that many believe has no place in the country today. And sure, the statues are an eyesore. They're a representation of, again, like you said, a bygone era. They're a representation of systematic oppression, racism, and slavery, and in a very dark time in American history. And a lot of them were actually erected after slavery had been abolished, as sort of a reminder of the power and the sway and the stranglehold that local politicians and authorities had on the culture of the southern states. In a lot of ways, you could say that these statues are kind of propaganda. They are propaganda placed in public places to essentially influence and control the behavior of certain individuals who are meant to interpret those statues in a particular way. Now, is the message that statues like these are supposed to send, is that as harmful to the black community as rap music, as hip-hop music, even the most lewd, most disgusting, most degrading rap music that one could imagine? I mean, my knee-jerk response to that just has to be no. And even if hip-hop is harmful, or could be argued as harmful as one of those statues, it most likely is in a completely different way. Because one is an art form, some of which may be incredibly tasteless, as Wynton highlights, created by the very people that it's allegedly harming, and the other, like the Confederate flag, is a representation of a military, of a political party that contributed to one of the darkest times in American history, whose influence we would hope by now is completely done away with. Those to me just seem like completely different things that don't really warrant any kind of comparison. And I guess those are my thoughts on this very large and very dense issue, and I think I'm going to leave it at that and let anybody who has anything to say about anything I've said just have at it in the comments down below. Over here next to my head is another video that you could check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, forever.